This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 123 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're talking about exploring cultural differences. I'm a little bit obsessed with cultural differences. Don't know why, just they really intrigue me. I guess I've lived in some places like Japan and Slovakia and Germany as well, but especially Japan, where there were a lot of differences in culture. And I guess that's part of what's made me so fascinated. But I'm always on the lookout for them. For example, ahead of my trip to Denmark later this year, I've been watching lots of Danish TV and movies, but one of them recently I was watching the series Dieter, about a journalist and policeman and stuff. And I saw some things happening just, by the by in the storyline that I wondered about and then Googled. And so I learned a couple of things about Danish cultural differences. For example, I learnt that on New Year's Eve in Denmark, you traditionally jump off the sofa at midnight to kind of jump into the new year, which I kind of like. And whenever they celebrated a birthday on this show, it was quite a long series, there would be all these Danish flags everywhere. Like everyone would wave flags, like the national flag, which I found kind of unusual. We definitely wouldn't do that here, only maybe on Australia Day. But apparently that's completely normal. It's not really a nationalist kind of thing. It's just a thing that you do in Denmark. So those kind of little cultural differences fascinate me endlessly. So we're going to talk about some more of them today across lots of different places. But before that, I need to welcome back this month's sponsor, Flightographer. So basically, if you're sick of having the photos from your trip, like either where not everyone's in the picture because someone's always taking it, or if they're kind of just selfies and they really look like selfies, or maybe just not great photos, then Flightographer might be your answer. So Flightographer has photographers situated in hundreds of cities all around the world, and including countries we talk about in today's show, like China, South Korea, Spain, Australia, and the US. And Flightographer will match you up with a photographer to spend an hour together in some of the most scenic parts of a city. So you'll end up with amazing professional family photos or photos with your travel buddies, whoever you're traveling with. Definitely one of those that most memorable souvenirs from a trip. And on top of that, you get to connect with a local. The photographers are always locals who have both photography and English skills. So if you want to ask them about some of the cultural differences, like we chat about in today's episode, you can do that with your photographer. So if you're curious, you can book a shoot on their website. Head to flightographer.com, and they have a special offer for podcast listeners. You can get $50 off a shoot by using the code Amanda50. Now on to our exploration of cultural differences, and the first guest today is Jacky Lamenzo, who spent a year living and teaching in China. And of course, as you'd imagine, from the US to China, there are numerous cultural differences, and we chat about some of them.
Language barriers and cultural barriers and, things that people were so sweet to us. And we always said, we would just smile and laugh. We don't know what's going on. We're just going to smile and laugh,
I think smile and laugh is often a good idea. Do you have a particular cultural difference or culture shock incident that you remember from your time in China?
So Charlotte and I are both blonde, blue eyes. Mm-hmm. And we I guess people could say we look alike, but we were twins and yes. We were nobody believed otherwise. And the craziest thing was so again, we were in Beijing, but we were, 45 minutes. So we're in this little community, in this little neighborhood. So people in that neighborhood quickly picked up on the fact that there were two blonde girls who were walking back and forth from school every day. And the pointing and talking about us quickly stopped, and everyone was nice, but people were really there, pointing at us, yeah. We're like, oh, hi, and so, but the craziest thing was when we would go to the Great Wall or Tiananmen Square or any of the big touristy places, people would come from outside of the city. Like people would come from the countryside of China and they would see us as foreigners for the first time in their lives. Like
you are the first foreigners they've seen like that. Yeah. Wow.
And I kid you not, I think we were in 35 to 40 family photos of people that we don't know. And we were just like, okay, if you really want us to do, and it was like nothing, we were nothing special. People just had never seen people that looked like us before, which was just so interesting. And it wasn't the people who lived in the city, because those people definitely have, and they've traveled and they've seen the expats that live in the city, but it was the people who lived and, and they're doing their one big family trip that they're coming to Beijing, and they're going to the capital city, and they're going to these big monuments, and they would see the two of us and they would ask us to take a picture with them.
Oh,
so that to me
sweet.
was just like so sweet. Oh my gosh. It was just so cool. It was so, we were just, we're sort of in awe, but we're like, okay, if you want to. And
because to you just look normal, but yeah.
Exactly. We're like, oh, okay. At first we thought they wanted us to take a picture of them, and they're like, no.
No, you.
So it was just, we had a lot of laughs. We had a lot of just funny, confusing, like, oh my goodness, what is happening right now,
Yeah.
But we laughed it off, and we had to go with the flow. And I think a lot of me getting over my food things, my control over food, because I think so much of it was I needed control. I needed to know, we're going to a new restaurant. This is before I went to China. We're going to a new restaurant for someone's birthday. I'm going to look up the menu and make sure there's something on there that I'm going to eat. And if there's not, I'm probably going to fake sick or something. I have to have that control to know that I can be in a comfortable enough situation. And that all went out the window when we left.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to
everything's
go
out of
with
your
the
control
flow.
in China.
Yeah. And we actually, when we decided to go, it was a little bit up in the air if we were going 6 months or a year. Like we didn't even know that. And we were sort of thinking, okay, maybe 6 months, but then we're like, we're not going to be able to get a job midway through the year if we're teaching back here. And so we got there, and about a week and a half in, they said, so you're staying the year? We're like, okay. I mean, it was just so go with the flow. And I think that really I think it helped me in a lot of ways in my life. Like, I think I was such a planner, and I still am a planner. Like, I still definitely can be organized and can, plan things out, but I definitely realize that things just flow and they happen for a reason, and things are going to shift.
I really love Jacky's attitude about just going with the flow. I think that applies a lot if you're traveling, even more so if you're living abroad, and always when you're confronted by cultural differences. It's definitely usually the best option to just go with the flow and see what happens. It kind of reminds me of lots of times when I was living in Japan and I'd be taken places by Japanese friends, and there were so many times I really had no clue what was happening. I just copied whatever they were doing and just went with the flow. And it always worked out completely fine. But, sometimes the cultural differences are so vast that you really don't know what's going on. But that's okay. You live and learn and you figure it all out in the end. So it's awesome stuff. All right. My next guests today are Lindsay and Marshall, who are an American couple spending time living in Spain. And we had a really interesting chat about some of the cultural differences that they've noticed between Spain and the United States.
I just love Barcelona and I love Europe, and I think that the lifestyle is amazing. And it takes away a lot of the things that were huge hassles of living in the States. For example, I never liked driving a car. And Austin, where we were living, is like so many cities in the US and likely Australia as well, is very car centric. And it gets so hot in Texas. I just hated putting our son in the car in the middle of August. It's really like 150 degrees in there when you first open the door.
It's awful.
And
That's a bit of an exaggeration. It's probably not higher than 120.
100.
It's very, very, very hot.
You would just cry every time you had to go into the car. I didn't like it. And so here we're walking everywhere. We live in a neighborhood where the streets are designed as pedestrian streets. And if there's a vehicle in it, it's like that's an aberration. And the vehicle is always watching out for the pedestrians versus the other way around. We also live right near a market where it's just so easy to go grocery shopping. It's really easy to just be walking around and run into your friends. And there's so much more street life. We really I loved our neighborhood in Austin and our neighbors, but it's so much easier here to just see a variety of people, do a variety of things, and relax when you're outside. Plus, the climate is great. And another thing is we're trying to start a business, or we're working on our business, which is our science podcast for kids. And now we have a travel blog, and it's so much easier for us to do that in a place where healthcare is actually affordable. And those kind of baseline expenses that require you to have a job in the US are just not there here. There's actually like a social safety net, which means that you can be healthy and have, you can have insurance for a very reasonable cost here.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I was talking to someone and he said like, my wife makes me buy private insurance and oh my God, it's so expensive. It's 40 euros a month. Can you believe how expensive that is? It's crazy. And it's like, and I couldn't respond. I just couldn't.
It's just the cost of healthcare in the healthcare system in the US is something that people cannot fathom in Europe. And I love them. Listen.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that you just can't even describe to people.
I know, because when I've heard some of what my friends in the States have to pay, like who are freelancers like me, and I'm just shocked. I would not have money left I wouldn't be able to eat if I had to pay that for my healthcare. So
yeah, let alone find a place to live or
other things. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the cost of living in Australia is fairly high, but just that, the medical stuff, blows my mind how much that sets people back. So I can see why Spain makes that very attractive, a much easier way to start a business than trying to do it while you're in the States.
Yeah, and I think it's a combination of really having things that we want to do here and valuing our time here and enjoying the lifestyle and being able to try out something that we want to be able to do. That living in the US would really not allow us to do.
I remember in a previous episode of the podcast, Lindsay and Marshall telling the story of if they were out with their son and he kicked a ball down the street, the ball would always come back. Someone else walking on the street would just kick it back to them. And I love that whole, and that to me sums up kind of that relaxed lifestyle that they describe pretty well. So definitely some differences between Spain and the US. Some differences between Spain and here too, by the sounds of it, although perhaps Australia lies a little in the middle of the two somehow. So I found that really an interesting conversation. Now, my final chat today is with Sandra Muller, who at the moment is still living in South Korea, and it is the cultural differences between Koreans and Australians that we discuss.
So I was living in South Korea teaching English. This is back in 2001. And I got a significant ankle injury while I was doing taekwondo because that's what one does in Korea. And I tore 3 ligaments, was on crutches for quite a while. And my social life became somewhat hampered. And I'd been going to a group called English Club, and it was where a bunch of Koreans would get together and ply us foreigners, as many as they could gather, to come to the pub with them. They'd ply us full of food and alcohol in exchange for like conversational English. Cool. It was a very structured thing, and I made some really good friends through the group, and it was a lot of fun, and we'd do more than just drinking together every Thursday night. There'd be weekend activities. We'd go hiking, go bowling, visit some of the tourist places, go to temples, that sort of stuff. So, it was a really good bunch of people. And so I hadn't been for quite a while because it was hard getting around on crutches and it was very icy as well. So as well as being someone who gets extraordinarily lost in extraordinarily normal circumstances, I'm also pretty clumsy.
So ice and crutches was a very bad combination then.
Yeah. But one night I decided I was going to go to English club, and it was probably January by now, so I'd been in Korea for about 5 months. And I walked in, and there was a seat next to the most beautiful creature I'd ever seen.
Oh.
And I sat down, and I took one look at him, and I just went, no, this is not a complication you need in your life right now.
And yet?
Yeah. And yet 6 months later, we left Korea together.
Oh.
We tried just to be friends for a little while, but it just, that was never going to happen. And then, it was supposed to be a short-lived thing, and now what, about 16 years later, we're
still
back
together.
in Korea. Yeah, after living in Australia together for 13 years.
Wow. Oh, that's lovely. And I'm always curious about the kind of like intercultural relationships and stuff, because obviously, Koreans have a really different culture to ours. So have there been any hiccups along the way?
Yeah, but I don't think that they're specifically cultural. And in a lot of ways, Koreans are very similar to Aussies. And
interesting.
I think they're probably the most similar to Australians of other, Asian cultures that I've met in places where I've travelled. They've kind of got that support for the underdog mentality that Australians have. We love cheering the underdog. And here's Korea, this tiny little nation squeezed between powerhouses Japan and China, and a significant history of being invaded and taken over and fighting for independence, etc.
Right.
So, they kind of got a bit of that eureka spirit about them.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have a really good sense of humour, really good sense of humour. And, some stuff that we laugh about is different. But, they're a pretty happy bunch, especially once you get to know people and once you've been introduced and you kind of fall into that inner circle. Really friendly, really warm, very, very humorous people.
Yeah, I mean, that backs up the experience I've had, which is I've spent a week in Korea and I did love it. And I did think, if I'd come here instead of Japan, I would have loved it equally and for different reasons.
Yeah.
But when I was teaching here in Australia, I had heaps of Korean students and they were all delightful. And they did fit in, I have to say, now that you say that, it makes me realise they did fit in surprisingly well to kind of Aussie culture here.
Yeah, I think particularly the younger ones, and they're very adventurous. And you have to keep in mind that Koreans have only had passports as individuals to travel since 1988.
Wow.
Which isn't very long to have developed kind of that
adventurous
international
mindset.
Wanderlust.
Yeah. Gosh.
So it's like 30 years ago.
Yeah. I was well and truly alive then. I was in high school.
Yeah. So, you think about all the 20-somethings that could have been travelling back then, but it just wasn't the done thing. So it's a fairly, their parents wouldn't have done it, had that gap year and gone travelling. Mm-hmm. So it's, pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing. I never stopped to think about it, but that's fascinating to think that in a short time, in one generation, they've become. I met we had hundreds and hundreds of Koreans to come through just our school who were spending 6 to 12 months away. Exploring Australia and learning English and stuff, and they definitely had a really adventurous spirit. So, yes, it must be something that's deep in the culture.
Or new.
Or
and even we stay in a lot of Korean places, and we often seek out Korean food when we're travelling as well, just because it's nice to have something that's familiar. And so we do encounter a lot of Koreans when we're travelling, and we just met some extraordinary young people. One woman had ridden her bike from San Diego to Lima, Peru.
Wow.
On our own. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That would be like the length of many, many, many careers.
Yes.
Such a tiny place.
Such a tiny country.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
It's funny, the more I thought about it after our chat, the more I kind of understood Sandra's ideas that Koreans and Australians have quite a lot, or surprising amount in common. I did get to meet heaps and heaps of Korean students when I was teaching English here in Perth. And they were always really easy to get along with. I'd never really thought that much about it. I'd always considered them to be, they're the neighbour to Japan, so perhaps they're more different to me and more similar to them, but perhaps it's somewhere in between. So yeah, they're certainly quite open and chatty, and yeah, it was interesting to think about this. And obviously, Sandra's married to a Korean and has lived there for some years over a couple of different stints. So yeah, she knows her stuff. So interesting stuff. What really piqued my interest was Sandra mentioning that Koreans have only actually been free to travel internationally, like completely freely, since the 1980s. I was shocked about that. I did a bit more reading to find out what it was all about, and apparently until then passports were only issued for a relatively narrow range of reasons, such as travelling for government business or for technical training and stuff like that, kind of to prevent local currency leaving South Korea, basically. So Wikipedia and the rest of the internet tell me. That's my brief summary. But anyway, I found that quite fascinating to think that basically they've only been freely able to travel for about 40 years. So not even that. Yeah, 30. So kind of amazing. Gosh, we're lucky to have been, I'm lucky to have been born in Australia, I think. Still, I wish it was a bit closer to the rest of the world, but you can't have everything. Anyway, that sums up our chat on exploring cultural differences. Thank you very much for listening to episode 123 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode at notaballerina.com/123. And you can also find my guests in various places around the internet. First up, I chatted with Jacky, and you can find her at jackylamenzo.com. I then had a talk with Lindsay and Marshall. You can find them in a couple of places. They have a blog at Tumble Travels, which is at tumbletravels.com. And they also have an awesome science podcast for kids. That's how I came across them, because my son just loves their podcast. It's called Tumble. And you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. Or also you can look at their website, sciencepodcastforkids.com. And finally, I chatted with Sandra, and you can find her at sandralmuller.com and at The Smarter Writer, which is at thesmarterwriter.com. Now, please come along and join our Facebook group. That's where we have all the fun and deep conversations about travelling thoughtfully. Hit the link in the show notes or head to Facebook and search for Thoughtful Travellers and you will find the group. And this week, I'm going to ask you a special favour. If you enjoy listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, why not share it with a like-minded friend? You might have another travel lover in your family or friend group who might also enjoy listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast. And I know there's still a lot of people out there who actually don't really know how to listen to podcasts or what they're all about. So how about you find one of those and show them how to listen to the Thoughtful Travel podcast? You might really make their day. You'll certainly make my day. So that's it for this episode. I'll be back again next week. Thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.